Panic has a taste. It sits at the back of your throat like cheap copper and cold coffee, and once it gets there, it does not leave quietly. Sloane Merritt knew that taste well. She had been living with it for 2 years, that low metallic burn that never fully faded, that always spiked the moment she heard a certain kind of footstep behind her. Tonight, the footsteps were real. She hit the marble floor of the Aldrich Grand Lobby at full speed, her stockinged feet slipping on the high-gloss tile, her arms pumping and her breath already ragged in her chest. Somewhere behind her, near the coat check, one of her heels had snapped clean off when she lunged sideways away from Brett's hand. The other shoe was gone, too abandoned somewhere between the bar and the corridor. She did not stop for either of them. She did not stop for anything. The lobby of the Aldrich Grand was the kind of place that swallowed sound. The ceilings were 3 stories high, draped in warm amber light that fell across white marble and dark wood and towering arrangements of ivory orchids. On any other night, as Sloane moved through this space like she belonged to it, because she did. She had managed the evening shift at Vero's, the hotel's flagship steakhouse, for 3 years. She knew which floorboards creaked near the service entrance. She knew which bartender poured heavy on Thursdays. She knew every corner of this building the way you only know a place when you have spent hundreds of nights inside it, quietly keeping it running while the guests never noticed you at all. Tonight, she was a guest who had overstayed everything. She could hear Brett behind her, not shouting, not yet, because Brett Holloway was smart enough to know that shouting in a luxury hotel lobby drew attention, and Brett despised attention that he had not chosen for himself. What she could hear was the uneven drag of his right foot, that slight, careless limp he only developed when he was 4 whiskeys past reasonable and looking for a target. She could hear the controlled, measured pace of a man who was not running because he did not need to run. He was certain she had nowhere to go. He had been certain of that for a long time. Sloane rounded the corner into the elevator bank. The alcove was quiet, lined with brushed steel doors that gave her back her own reflection in fragments. A dark-haired woman in a ruined shift dress, mascara cracked and smeared beneath her left eye, the silk twisted around her hips, from the sprint across the lobby. She looked like exactly what she was. She looked like a woman who had made the mistake of believing things could be different. She jammed her thumb into the glowing call button and did not stop pressing it. It would not make the car arrive faster. She knew that. She pressed it anyway. Above the center doors, the digital display showed the car descending. 8, 7. The ambient jazz playing through the lobby speakers felt absurd, light and slow, and completely indifferent to the sound of Brett's footsteps growing louder around the corner. 6, 5. She pressed her forehead against the cool steel of the door. The metal was cold against her skin, and she focused on that, just the temperature against her skull, not the way her lungs were burning, not the way her ankle was screaming from the welt left by the broken heel strap, not the way Brett's voice had sounded at the table when he leaned in close and told her very quietly that she was going to sit back down. 4, 3. She had not sat back down. A heavy hand slammed against the mahogany paneling just outside the elevator alcove. Sloane did not turn around. She heard the wall take the impact, heard Brett's breath wet and rough from the whiskey. She heard him find her with his eyes before she heard him speak. "Running," he said. He almost laughed when he said it, that low, contemptuous sound she knew better than almost any sound in the world. "Really?" 1. The soft, melodic chime of the arriving elevator sounded like a gunshot. The doors began to part. They moved with that particular slowness that only elevator doors achieve when every second matters, deliberate and mechanical, and entirely unmoved by anything happening to the human being standing in front of them. Sloane did not wait for them to open fully. She turned sideways and pushed through the gap, her shoulder scraping hard against the metal frame, and threw herself backward into the car. She hit the control panel with the heel of her palm, punching the door close button over and over. Not looking at the panel, not looking anywhere, except the narrowing gap between the steel doors as Brett rounded the corner into the alcove. "Come on." She breathed the words rather than said them. Her voice had broken somewhere in the last 3 minutes. "Come on, come on." Brett was 10 feet away. Then 5. His fingers reached toward the gap, those thick, broad fingers she had spent so long learning to read, learning to predict, trying to stay ahead of. For one suspended, sickening moment, she was absolutely certain he was going to catch the edge of the door, trigger the sensor, and pry the car back open with nothing more than the particular kind of stubbornness that had always been his most reliable quality. But he was a half-second too slow. The doors met with a heavy, definitive thud. A breath later, his fist connected with the outside of the steel, three hard impacts that rang through the walls of the car and up through the soles of Sloane's feet. Then the elevator moved upward and the sound of him disappeared. Sloane's legs stopped working. It was not a decision. Her knees simply unlocked, and she slid down the mirrored back wall of the car until she hit the carpeted floor, landing hard, her arms wrapping around her shins, her face dropping into her knees. She was shaking. Not the fine, controlled tremor of adrenaline beginning to build, but the full, violent shaking of a body that had been running on pure emergency fuel and had just run completely dry. She stayed like that, 30 seconds, maybe more. The elevator hummed around her. The air conditioning breathed cold and steady. The soft, mechanical rhythm of the cables was the only sound. It took her longer than it should have to notice that the air did not smell like a hotel elevator. Hotel elevators smelled like recycled air and other people's perfume, and the particular staleness of a sealed box that had carried thousands of strangers. This air smelled like cedar and cold smoke, and something expensive underneath both of those, something dark and layered, like a room that had seen serious things and kept quiet about all of them. Sloane went still, not the trembling stillness of fear, a different kind, the deep instinctual stillness of a body that has just registered something important and is waiting for the brain to catch up. She lifted her head. He was standing in the opposite corner of the elevator. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had simply been there the entire time, standing against the brass railing with his hands resting in the pockets of a charcoal suit that had been made specifically for the shape of his shoulders. He was not looking at her with pity. He was not looking at her with irritation. He was not looking at her the way people look at a stranger who has collapsed on the floor in front of them and created an uncomfortable social obligation. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he is categorizing. Flat, dark eyes, completely calm, the kind of calm that is not the absence of danger, but the long familiarity with it. Sloane knew this hotel. She knew its guests, the corporate retreats and the anniversary dinners, and the quiet businessmen who tipped in hundreds and made no eye contact with the waitstaff. She knew the difference between a man who was powerful and a man who was genuinely dangerous. She had learned that difference the hard way over the last 2 years. This man was not simply powerful. Her gaze dropped to his right hand where it rested loosely in his jacket pocket and found the ring on his index finger. Heavy silver dull in the overhead light, a deep carved crest she had seen before, not up close, never up close, but in photographs in the Tribune's business section and on the side of a building near the port, and once late on a Tuesday shift on the hand of a man in a booth at Vero's, who had very quietly made an entire corner of the restaurant hold its breath for 90 minutes simply by sitting in it. A wolf's head tangled in thorns, the Drave family crest. Sloane had grown up in Chicago. She had worked the city's restaurant industry for 7 years, moved through its kitchens and its dining rooms and its late-night service wells, had heard the name, the way you hear weather reports routinely without drama, simply as information about the environment you were living in. Cassian Drave, eldest son, inherited the port operations and the real estate holdings and everything beneath them at 31 after his father's death, expanded quietly, strategically, without the noise that usually accompanied that kind of expansion. The papers called him the city's landlord. The people who moved inside the city's darker geography called him something else entirely and said it at a lower volume. She was sitting on the floor of his elevator. The hysterical edge of a laugh climbed her throat, and she bit down on it hard, pressing her knuckles against her mouth. Of all the elevators in this building, of all the possible cars she could have thrown herself into without looking, the laugh died before it reached air. What replaced it was a cold, very specific clarity, the kind that arrives when panic has burned itself out completely and left behind nothing but the bare facts of a situation. She had escaped Brett Holloway. She had landed in a cage that belonged to Cassian Drave. She pulled herself to her feet. Her ankles screamed at the weight. She grabbed the brass handrail and got upright, pressing her back against the opposite wall, putting as much of the small car between them as physics would allow. She fixed her eyes on the floor display. 12, 13. "You are bleeding," he said. His voice was a low, even sound that did not bounce off the walls. It was absorbed by them. No inflection of concern, no particular interest. A simple statement delivered with the flat efficiency of a man who processed information without editorializing about it. Sloane looked down. The inside of her left forearm, where she had scraped it against the door frame in her sideways push into the car, was bleeding in a thin dark line. She had not felt it happen. She had not felt anything happen in the last several minutes, except the one thing she had been running from. She pressed her thumb against the scrape. "I am fine." The words came out rough and quiet, barely words at all. He did not respond. He simply watched her. The elevator slowed. The display read 25. Sloan had not pressed 25. She had not pressed anything except the closed door button. The doors opened onto a dim, carpeted residential corridor. Sloan's muscles contracted before she had consciously decided anything. She looked at the gap between the steel doors, calculated the distance, and stopped. Two men were standing in the hallway. They were large men dressed in dark suits, hands folded in front of them, eyes moving to Sloan for one brief, impersonal moment before settling on Cashin with the quality of attention that belongs to people whose job is to be in the exact right place before they are asked to be there. They did not step forward. They did not speak. They were simply present, solid as structural beams between Sloan and the stairwell at the far end of the hall. She looked back at Cassian. He had not moved toward the door. He was watching her process the situation with those flat, dark eyes, watching the calculation happen behind her face, unhurried as if he had all night and fully intended to use it. "It seems," he said, his voice dropping, slightly smoothing into something quieter and more deliberate, "you have run out of places to run." He was not wrong. He stepped out of the car. The two men in the hallway parted for him without a word, creating a corridor through which he walked with the ease of a man who has never in his adult life needed to ask for space. He did not look back at her. Sloan stood at the threshold. The elevator sensor beeped its steady warning. One of the men, the taller one with a pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow, had placed his palm flat against the rubber edge of the door. The car was not going anywhere. Cashin's voice came from down the hall, not turned toward her, almost conversational. "You can ride back down to the lobby. The man throwing glassware was at the reception desk when we passed it. Or you can step out. The choice is yours." It was not a choice. She understood that. It was a precisely constructed pair of options designed to look like a choice offered by a man who already knew which one she would take because he had accurately assessed the situation the moment she threw herself through his elevator doors. Brett was downstairs, drunk and furious, and completely certain that he had the right to whatever he was angry about, the way he had always been certain of that, the way 2 years of small surrenders had helped him become certain of it. Cassian Drabe was in the hallway. Sloan stepped out of the elevator. The doors closed behind her. The corridor was hushed, wrapped in dark wallpaper and low amber light, the carpet thick enough to swallow her uneven footsteps entirely. Her bare feet were cold against the floor. She walked with her weight shifted to her left leg, favoring the ankle, trying not to let the limp show, and almost managing it. Cassian was at the end of the hall, standing before a pair of heavy oak doors. He had a key card in his hand, turning it against his thigh, and he watched her approach with the same steady measuring quality he had given her in the elevator. Not cruel, not kind, simply watching the way you watch a variable you have not yet assigned a value. He pressed the card to the reader. The deadbolt disengaged with a heavy mechanical sound. He pushed the door open and walked inside, leaving it ajar. The two men from the hallway took up positions on either side of the oak doors. They were not coming in. Their function was entirely directional. Sloan reached the doorway. She put her hand on the frame and looked into the suite. It was vast. Floor-to-ceiling windows along the far wall gave the room the quality of a high-altitude observation deck, the entire spread of nighttime Chicago glittering below in its grid of amber and white and the distant red of moving traffic. The furniture was minimal and severe, dark leather and brushed steel and polished slate. Nothing on the walls, nothing decorative anywhere. No evidence of a person living here. Evidence only of a person occupying it the way you occupy a position rather than a home. She crossed the threshold. The hardwood was cold against her feet. The door clicked shut behind her. The suite was silent in the way that very expensive, very well-insulated spaces are silent completely, as if the world outside had simply agreed to leave this particular room alone. Cassian had moved to the marble island separating the entry from the main living area. He shrugged his jacket off and draped it over a bar stool in a single casual motion. Beneath it, strapped to his ribs in a black leather holster, was a handgun. He did not acknowledge it. He did not adjust the shirt to cover it. It was simply part of the landscape of him, the way the ring was, the way the stillness was. "Sit," he said. Sloan did not argue. The ankle had been arguing loudly enough for both of them since she stepped off the elevator. She crossed to the long charcoal sofa that faced the windows and sat in the corner of it, pulling her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins. The leather was cold through the thin silk of her dress. She kept her eyes on the city below because looking at the city was easier than looking at the room. She heard water running, the sound of a cabinet opening and closing. Then his footsteps measured on the hardwood. He set a black medical kit on the glass coffee table and pulled the table closer to the sofa with one hand. He sat on its edge directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver lines of old scars across his knuckles, the precise geometry of the ink on his forearm below the rolled cuff. He opened the kit. "Give me your arm," he said. Sloane tightened her arms around her ribs. "It just needs soap." He looked up from the kit. The dark eyes found hers and held them with a pressure that was not aggressive, but was entirely unyielding. "I am not asking for your medical opinion. Give me your arm or I will take it. One takes considerably less effort than the other." The fight went out of her, not because of the threat, or not only because of that, mostly because she was too empty to sustain it. She uncurled her arm and extended it toward him, her hand trembling finely, and he took her wrist. His grip was firm and impersonal, warm surprisingly. She had expected cold. He drew a damp cloth across the scrape, and she hissed at the flare of pain, her back lifting from the cushion. "Hold still," he said, not gently. It was an instruction. He discarded the cloth and tore open an antiseptic wipe with his teeth. "You fight like a cornered stray," he said, pressing the pad to the raw skin. Sloane gasped. Her free hand dug into the leather. Tears hid her eyes strictly from the pain. "I was running for my life," she said. "You were running blindly." He kept his eyes on the wound. "You did not look before you entered the car. You did not assess what was already inside it. You reacted to the noise behind you and nothing else." He applied the bandage in 3 precise movements, pressing the tape flat with his thumb. "That is a good way to get yourself killed." Something sharp and old moved through her chest, that particular anger that lives underneath fear, the anger at being instructed on survival by someone who has never had to survive the specific thing you are surviving. "Because you are so much better," she said. "You are just going to patch me up and send me on my way." He paused. The bandage was done. He did not move away. He looked at her, and something shifted fractionally in the flat darkness of his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition, the faintest recalibration of whatever assessment he had been building since the elevator. "You have a sharp tongue," he said, "for a woman bleeding on a stranger's sofa. I have had a bad night." He released her wrist. He sat back slightly, his eyes moving over her face, reading her the way you read a document, extracting information without sentiment. "I am not treating your arm out of charity," he said. "You were bleeding on my floor. I dislike mess." A sound escaped her that was almost a laugh. "Right. God forbid I ruin the Italian leather." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he closed the medical kit with a sharp snap and set it aside. "Now," he said, "we need to address the fact that the man downstairs is currently making a scene in my lobby, and I need to decide whether you are worth the inconvenience of dealing with him." The word "worth" landed like a stone, dropped into cold water. "I am not a thing," she said. He reached into his jacket for a phone. He did not look up. "At this exact moment," he said, "you are an unexpected variable sitting on my furniture. To the man downstairs, you are property. To me, you are a problem I have not yet assigned a category to." He turned the phone screen toward her. It was a security feed split into 4 quadrants. The bottom right showed the lobby. Brett was at the concierge desk, his back to the camera, one hand braced against the marble counter. His body language as legible from above as it had ever been up close. The night clerk's face was pale and still. Brett was not shouting. He had always preferred the particular power of controlled fury, the kind that left the other person uncertain about exactly how bad it was going to get. "He is going to find out what floor this car went to," Sloane said quietly. "He knows people here. He will find out." "Let him find out," Cashin said. "The elevators to these floors require encrypted key cards. The stairwells are locked from the outside. If he bypasses both, he meets the men in the hallway. If he somehow survives that which he will not, he meets me." He set the phone down. "Your ex-boyfriend is loud. Loud men are rarely as dangerous as they believe themselves to be. They rely on fear. Remove the fear and they become noise." Sloane looked at the feed, at Brett's rigid shoulders, at the clerk trying to maintain professional composure. "You do not understand him," she said. "He does not give up when his pride is hurt. He will take this building apart. Let him try to take my building apart, Cassian said very softly. The possessive landed in the room and stayed there. His building. Of course, the Drave family did not rent penthouses. They owned what sat beneath them. Sloane sat with that for a moment. She had run from a man who hit her and landed in a room that belonged to a man who had men stationed in hallways. And the strangest part, the part she could not quite fit into any framework she owned, was that she felt safer here than she had felt anywhere in 2 years. She hated that she felt that. "Why are you letting me stay?" she asked. "You said I am an inconvenience. Give me to the men in the hallway and send me out the back." "Why am I sitting here?" He looked at her for a long moment. The city light came through the windows and crossed the sharp angles of his face, the jaw, the nose, the flat considering eyes. He was not looking at her the way Brett looked at her. He was not looking at her the way anyone had looked at her in a very long time. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a thing they are genuinely trying to understand. "Because you did not beg," he said. She held very still. When the doors closed, he continued, "You did not ask me to save you. You did not perform distress for an audience of one. You assessed the threat. You recognized who I was. You evaluated your odds." His head tilted a fraction. "That is not weakness looking for a rescuer. That is something else entirely." He stood the motion smooth and soundless. "I have not decided yet what to call it." He picked up his jacket from the bar stool. "There is a guest room at the end of the hall. The bathroom has towels. Wash the blood off your legs and try to sleep. The men outside will remain where they are until morning." And then she said, he had already turned toward the inner corridor. He paused without turning back, his hand finding the wall at the hallway entrance. "Tomorrow the noise downstairs will be resolved. You will walk out the front entrance. What comes after that is entirely your concern." He did not say goodnight. He walked into the dark of the corridor and was gone. Sloane sat alone in the large, quiet room. The city burned in the windows. 40 floors of glass and steel and 100,000 lit squares, all of it indifferent, all of it beautiful, all of it completely unconcerned with the specific weight of what she was carrying. She looked down at the white bandage on her arm, precisely applied edges, flat and smooth. She was safe tonight. She understood that the safety was transactional, that it came with no promise attached to it, that the man who had provided it would not lose a moment of sleep over anything that happened to her after she walked out the front entrance tomorrow morning. She understood all of that. She also understood, sitting very still on the cold leather sofa, that it was the first night in 6 months she was not going to spend listening for footsteps. For right now, that was enough. The guest room was severe and clean. White linens pulled tight. No personal details. A furniture showroom with better plumbing. Sloane went straight for the bathroom, pushed the frosted glass door open, and stood at the marble vanity for a long time looking at herself in the mirror. She looked like the last 2 years. She turned on the shower and stepped under it without waiting for it to warm, gasping at the cold, then standing motionless as it heated around her. She scrubbed her skin with the block of soap she found in the marble alcove. Cedar. The scent settled over her and she scrubbed harder, and then at some point she stopped scrubbing and simply stood under the water and let it run. When she got out, she had no clean clothes. She could not put the ruined shift dress back on. She opened the oak dresser out of necessity and found a neat row of folded shirts, black and charcoal gray, impossibly soft under her fingers. She pulled one over her head. It fell to the middle of her thighs. She got into the bed and pulled the duvet to her chin and lay in the dark, looking at the ceiling. She did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind ran the loop. The bar, the look on Brett's face when she stood up from the table, the sprint across the lobby, the elevator doors, the ring, the flat dark eyes in the corner. She ran it forward and backward and sideways and still could not find the place where she had made a different choice that led to a different room. By 2 in the morning, her throat was dry and the anxiety had taken on a physical quality, something clawing at the inside of her sternum. That movement might manage better than stillness. She got up. She moved quietly down the dark hallway, navigating by the ambient light from the windows rounding the corner into the main room. He was there. He sat in the low leather chair nearest the windows, a crystal glass loose in his right hand, the amber of the whiskey catching the city light. He had changed out of the charcoal suit into dark trousers and a plain gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up past the elbows. The ink on his forearms was dark in the low light. He was not looking at anything in particular. He was looking at Chicago the way you look at something you have studied for so long, it no longer requires your active attention. He had known she was there before she reached the room. She was certain of that. The water is filtered through the tap, he said. He did not turn his head. Sloane moved to the kitchen side of the island and found a glass. She filled it and drank without speaking, her back to him, looking at the row of dark cabinet fronts. She should go back to the room. She knew she should go back to the room. Did he leave, she asked. She heard him take a slow sip. Yes. He made a scene. My men removed him from the hotel. He is currently with a fractured cheekbone in the back of a cab going nowhere useful. Sloane set the glass down. You had them hurt him. I had them remove a problem from my property. He set his own glass down on the side table with a quiet click. Trash gets dented when you put it out. That is not cruelty. That is physics. She stood at the counter for a moment longer. She thought about the voicemail she had heard in a different version of tonight, the certainty in Brett's voice, the complete, unshakable conviction that she belonged to him the way furniture belongs to a room. Go back to sleep, he said. Tomorrow you disappear. She went back to the room. She lay in the dark for another hour before something loosened in her chest and she slept deeply and without dreaming for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. The light that came through the gap in the curtains was the flat white light of a Chicago morning in early winter. No warmth in it, just brightness. Sloane woke with her heart slamming and her hand already reaching for the edge of the mattress before her brain had fully reoriented her. Then the room settled into focus. The tight white linens, the severe oak furniture, the scent of cedar still faint in the borrowed shirt. She lay still for a moment and let herself remember where she was. She sat up and checked her arm. The bandage was still clean and flat. Her ankle had gone purple and yellow overnight, a bruise spread below the joint in a wide mottled crescent. She pressed her thumb against it, winced, and got up anyway. She moved to the bathroom and ran cold water on her face, deliberately not looking in the mirror this time. She had looked at herself enough last night. She needed to think clearly this morning. She needed to figure out the specific geography of what came next. When she came into the main room, he was at the island. He was already dressed in navy suit with the jacket missing sleeves rolled up, working on something on a sleek silver laptop. A ceramic mug of espresso sat near his left hand. He did not look up as her bare feet crossed the floor. There is a bag on the sofa, he said. She stopped. On the charcoal sofa, centered precisely on the middle cushion, was a brown paper shopping bag. She crossed to it and looked inside. Dark jeans, a black cashmere sweater, a pair of flat leather shoes. Tucked into the collar of the sweater was a small white envelope. She stood holding the bag for a moment. He had sent someone out before she was awake. He had known her approximate size by looking at her. He had decided at some point in the night that she was leaving this building in something that would not attract attention, and he had arranged for that to happen before she even asked for it. The efficiency of it was colder than any deliberate unkindness. You did not have to do this, she said. He closed the laptop. He turned toward her and picked up his espresso. You could not walk out of this building in a torn dress without becoming a problem, he said. I have told you, I dislike mess. He took a slow sip. There is a car in the private garage. The driver will take you wherever you need to go within the city. Give him an intersection, not an address. Walk the rest of the way. She took the bag to the guest room. The jeans fit exactly. The sweater was soft in the way that things are soft when they cost more than a week of your tips. She opened the white envelope. $500 bills, clean and uncreased. She stood holding them for a moment. Then she put the money back in the envelope and carried it back to the main room and set it on the marble counter next to his laptop. He looked at the envelope, then at her. I do not need your money, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Pride is a luxury for people who are not being hunted, he said. Take it. You will most likely need to break your lease. I will manage. He looked at her steadily. Something shifted in his expression. Not much of fractional recalibration, the look of a person whose initial estimate of something has been revised upward without announcement. Suit yourself, he said. He gestured toward the oak doors. The elevator is unlocked. The car is in the garage. She picked up her canvas bag from where she had left it near the sofa. She turned toward the doors. She walked the length of the room without hurrying. His voice came from behind her, quiet and even. Good luck, Sloane. Her name in his voice was a physical thing. She did not know why it was. She was through the oak doors and into the waiting elevator before she finished deciding whether or not to turn around. The doors closed behind her. She rode down alone. The private garage was cool and dim, lit in long fluorescent strips. The black sedan parked near the exit looked like a prop in a film about quiet power. The driver was a large, silent man who did not offer his name or make eye contact. He simply unlocked the car when she approached. She gave him an intersection 3 blocks from her building. The drive took 20 minutes through the gray, uncrowded streets of a Chicago weekday morning. The driver did not speak. Sloan watched the city go past the tinted window and thought about the way Cassian's voice had sounded when he said her name. Not the content of it, not the luck. He wished her just the sound of it, the quality of a person who says a thing because it is true and not because it will land well. The sedan stopped at the intersection. She got out. She waited until it pulled away before she moved. Her building was 3 blocks north, a narrow brick structure crammed between a dry cleaner and a bodega, the kind of building that had once been acceptable and had since become simply affordable. She pushed through the front door, bypassed the elevator, and took the stairs with her weight on the good leg. Her hands were unsteady with her keys. She dropped them twice. The deadbolt turned. She was inside. She threw the bolt in the chain and dragged a dining chair under the knob, the same way she had been doing it on bad nights for the last 6 months. She stood in the small hallway with her back to the door and looked at her apartment. The cheap vanilla candles she burned to cover the neighbor's smoke. The stack of management binders on the kitchen table she had been meaning to reorganize. The photograph of her and her sister at the lake taken 6 years ago before any of this. It looked like her life. It felt like a place she had already left. The answering machine on the counter was blinking red. 14 messages. She crossed the room and pressed play. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the voice of a man she had spent 2 years trying to read correctly, moving through its stages the way weather moves. The slurred initial fury, the crashing glass in the background of message 3, the wet, pathetic grief of messages 8 and 9 when the alcohol hit the middle of its arc and produced that particular misery that was always somehow her fault too. Then the promises, then the anger again. Message 14 came in at 4:17 in the morning. Brett's voice was completely sober, controlled and tight the way it got when the alcohol had burned off and left only the cold, unimpaired version of the thing underneath. She could hear the particular texture of his breathing, shallow and effortful, the way he breathed when he was managing significant physical pain. "I found out what floor that elevator went to," he said. "The bartender talks. You think you are safe because you spent the night with some rich man in a penthouse. You think he cares about what happens to you. He is going to throw you out. And when he does, I am going to be here. You hear me? I do not care who he is. You are mine." The machine clicked to silence. Sloan stood in the kitchen. She looked at the blinking 0 on the display. She looked at the window above the sink, at the gray winter light coming through the grimy glass. She looked at the white bandage on her arm. The police had a report from 11 months ago. They had given her a pamphlet and a case number and the information that they could not do anything proactive, only responsive, which meant she would need to call them after the thing she was trying to prevent had already happened. She had not called them again. She had moved the chair under the door instead. She looked at the canvas bag on the floor. The entire inventory of what she had taken with her last night. Socks, underwear, 2 shirts, a toothbrush, the entire portable sum of her life. She thought about what Cassian had said, sitting in the leather chair in the dark at 2 in the morning, looking at Chicago with the patience of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by it. Loud men always come back. They mistake a closed door for surrender. She picked up the canvas bag. She did not pack anything else. She did not pack photographs or throw blankets or the 7 years of accumulated small details that added up roughly to the evidence that a person had once lived in a particular set of rooms. She zipped the bag. It weighed almost nothing. She stood in the center of her kitchen for one long moment. Then she picked up the envelope from where she had left it on the counter. She put it in the pocket of the dark jeans. She was not going back to be managed. She was going back because Brett Holloway did not understand what he was provoking, because he never had, because arrogance at his scale required a consistent and specific blindness to consequence that she had spent 2 years absorbing the cost of, and she was done absorbing it alone. She was going back to the only door in Chicago that a man like Brett Holloway would not put his fist through. She was going back to negotiate. She pulled the dining chair away from the door. She left the chain on the inside. She walked out. The lobby of the Aldrich Grand looked different in daylight. The amber warmth that made it feel like a sealed world at night was replaced by flat gray light coming through the tall front windows. And in that light, the marble floors showed their scuffs, and the orchid arrangements looked slightly tired, and the whole place had the quality of a stage set between performances. Sloane pushed through the revolving door and felt the refrigerated air hit her face. The morning concierge looked up from his monitor. His professional smile arrived first trained and automatic, and then something shifted behind his eyes as he took her in. The bruised ankle she was not quite hiding, the canvas bag, the face that had been scrubbed clean but still carried the remnant shadows of last night. "I need to send a message to the penthouse," Sloane said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "To Cassian Drave." The concierge went completely still. His hand stopped on the keyboard. His eyes darted to the lobby entrance, then to the far corners of the room, the rapid check of a person who has just heard something said out loud that is not supposed to be said at a hotel desk at 9 in the morning. "I am sorry, but we do not have anyone by that." "Tell him Sloane is downstairs," she said. She moved away from the desk before he could offer the rest of the prepared response and lowered herself onto an emerald green sofa near the window, setting her bag between her feet. She sat and she waited. 8 minutes passed, then the elevator at the far end of the bank opened and Egan stepped out. She recognized him immediately, the scar through the eyebrow, the density of him in a dark suit, the quality of stillness that belonged to men who did not need to announce themselves because the space around them adjusted without being asked. He crossed the lobby and stopped in front of her sofa and gave a single definitive nod toward the elevator bank. Sloane stood. She picked up her bag. She followed him. The elevator ride up was silent. She watched the floor numbers climb and kept her breathing even and did not rehearse what she was going to say. She had found in her life that scripted conversations with dangerous people went worse than honest ones. Scripted things sounded like what they were. The oak doors at the end of the corridor were ajar. Morning light from the suite's far windows spilled into the hall. She walked to the doors and pushed them open. Cassian was standing at the windows with his back to her. Dark trousers, a slate gray shirt with the sleeves rolled. He was holding nothing, simply standing and looking at Chicago. "You are remarkably bad at following instructions," he said. Sloane crossed to the glass coffee table and set her canvas bag down. The bag hit the hardwood with a soft, certain thud. She reached into the pocket of the jeans and took out the white envelope and placed it flat on the table. She stood straight. "I cannot outrun him," she said. "He left a voicemail at 4 in the morning. He is sober in it, which is when he is most dangerous. He knows I was here last night. He knows your name. Brett Holloway is not smart enough to be afraid of that, and he is not the kind of man who stops because a door is closed. He stops when there is genuinely nowhere left to push." Cassian turned. He moved toward her and stopped on the other side of the coffee table. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the canvas bag. Then he looked at her face, and whatever he found there, he held for a moment before he spoke. "And your solution," he said, "is to return to the man who told you to disappear. My solution is to find the one place in this city where a man like Brett Holloway cannot kick the door in." She held his gaze. "You said loud men rely on fear, that if you take away the fear, they are just noise. I have used up every other option I have. I need your doors, not your charity, not your pity. Tell me what that costs, and I will decide if I can pay it." The room was very quiet around them. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "If you stay behind my doors, you operate under my rules. You do not leave this building without Egan. You do not contact anyone from your previous life. You do not ask questions about my work or my associates or anything that happens in rooms you are not invited into." He paused. "Your safety and your presence here belong to this house for as long as you are in it." Sloane absorbed the words. She thought about the word belong and the specific weight it carried when Brett used it and the way it felt entirely different when Cassian said it. Not like a chain, like an operating agreement, terms stated plainly rather than assumed. "What do you want from me?" she said in return. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nothing yet. That is what I am determining." He moved to the island and picked up his espresso. "There is a second room at the end of the East Hall. Follow the rules and we will have no conflict." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she reached down and picked up the canvas bag. She did not go home. The second room was smaller than the guest room where she had slept the night before, but it had a window that looked east over the city and a desk along one wall and a bathroom with good water pressure. Egan showed her where the towels were, where the secondary kitchen was stocked, and where the building's private elevator required a card to access the residential floors. He moved through the information with the efficiency of a man completing an assigned task. No commentary, no visible opinion about what he had been assigned. When he was done, he looked at her once briefly and left. Sloane put her bag on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the east window. It was mid-morning now. The streets visible from this height carried their ordinary weekday traffic, yellow cabs and delivery trucks, and small figures on the sidewalks moving with the focused purposefulness of people who had somewhere to be and expected to get there. She thought about her shift at Vero's. She was scheduled for tonight at 5. She was not going to make it. She thought about Petra, her longest colleague at the restaurant, who had texted her 3 times last night with progressively more worried variations of the same question. She could not answer those either. Not yet. She sat in the room that belonged to a man whose first name she had known from newspaper photographs before last night, and whose ring she had recognized from a distance, and whose world she was now, by her own deliberate choice, sitting inside of. And she looked out the window at a city that had no idea and went on being itself regardless. She had agreed to 3 rules. She had agreed to them the way you agree to the terms of a lease on an apartment. You need badly enough that you read every clause carefully and sign anyway because the alternative is worse, and you understand exactly what you are signing. No leaving without Egan, no outside contact, no questions about the work. She could follow 3 rules. She had been following much harder rules than these for the last 2 years, rules that were never stated clearly and changed without notice, and came with consequences she had not agreed to. 3 rules with explicit terms felt almost generous. On the second day, she learned the shape of his schedule without meaning to. He was at the island with the laptop by 7:30. 2 espressos back-to-back, both black. He took calls in the inner room with the door closed, his voice audible as a low, steady presence, but the words indistinguishable. He was gone by 9, returning in the late afternoon, sometimes with Egan, sometimes alone. He ate once a day that she observed in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen island, reading from a tablet, not quickly but not slowly, the way a man eats when food is fuel and ritual has never interested him. He did not make conversation. He did not explain his presence or his absence. He occupied the suite the way the furniture occupied it, completely, and without apology, as though the space had been built around his specific requirements, and had no opinion about what else came to share it. Sloane occupied her end of the arrangement. She followed the rules. She did not ask questions. She stayed out of the service levels and the conference floors. She spent her mornings at the desk with the laptop she had asked Egan for on the first afternoon, working through the administrative backlog she had built up in her final weeks at Vero's. Professional correspondence, updated records, the ordinary bureaucracy of a job she suspected she was no longer employed in. She spent her afternoons in the hotel gym on the 14th floor, working her body until the anxiety that gathered at the base of her sternum had somewhere to go besides her own chest. The ankle healed faster than she expected. She watched everything. She watched because watching was what she knew how to do. 3 years managing Vero's evening shift had given her the ability to read rooms the way other people read faces. She could walk into a space and within 30 seconds have a working map of every tension inside it, who was angry at whom, who was performing something they did not feel, which table was going to need managing before the main course arrived. 2 years before that had given her a different kind of watching. The exhausting, involuntary vigilance of a person who has learned that paying close attention to the one they live with is the only early warning system available to them. She had developed an acuity for small signals that most people never needed to develop. The angle of a shoulder, the temperature of a silence, the difference between a pause that was thoughtful and a pause that was building towards something else. She watched Egan and understood that his loyalty was absolute and his silence was a form of competence rather than blankness. He was not a man of few words because he had nothing to say. He was a man who had long ago determined that most words were unnecessary and had stopped producing them out of discipline rather than incapacity. She respected that. She had spent too long around a man who filled every silence with noise. She watched the men who occasionally appeared in the hallway and understood they were rotations, not permanent presences, and that their deference to Cassian was genuine rather than performed. There was a difference. She could see it. She watched Cassian. She watched the way he moved through the suite with an economy of motion that was not hurried but was never wasted, each action going exactly where it needed to go and stopping there. She watched the way he read not the words but the posture of reading the particular forward lean that meant he was inside something difficult, rather than processing something routine. She watched the way he went to the windows when he was thinking, not looking at the city exactly, but using it as a surface to think against the way some people use walls or ceilings. He was always thinking. The flat dark eyes that seemed to look through things were actually looking at them very carefully, processing in a way that kept no external record-producing conclusions he acted on without announcement. On the third evening, she was sitting at the kitchen island with a book she was not reading when he came in from whatever the day had required and set his jacket over the bar stool and poured 2 inches of whiskey without looking at her. He held the bottle for a moment after he set his glass down. Then he poured a second glass and pushed it across the marble in her direction without comment. She looked at the glass. She looked at him. He had already turned back toward the windows. She picked up the glass. She did not say thank you because she understood instinctively that thank you was not the register this was operating in. This was not generosity in the conventional sense. It was something else, acknowledgement, perhaps the small gesture of a man who did not make small gestures toward people he had not decided to acknowledge. She drank the whiskey. It was very good whiskey. She looked out the windows at the city, and he stood at the windows looking at the city, and neither of them said anything. And it was the most comfortable 10 minutes she had spent in a long time, which told her something about the last 2 years that she already knew, but had perhaps not fully accounted for. On the fourth morning, everything changed. She woke to a knock on the east room door. Egan, he told her Cassian wanted to speak with her. She found him at the kitchen island, both espressos already finished, the ceramic cups in their precise pair near the sink. He placed his phone on the marble between them and turned the screen toward her. He had received a message from an unknown number. It said, "She told me everything. I can be patient." Sloane read it twice. The words were simple, and the meaning was not complicated. She looked up. "This is Brett." He nodded once. He obtained a secondary number sometime in the last 48 hours. He has been attempting to locate which specific property you are in. He has not yet succeeded. He set the phone down. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly." She put down her coffee cup and looked at him. "Have you communicated with anyone outside this building since you arrived here?" Number. "Have you told anyone where you are?" Number. He held her gaze with the measuring stillness she had come to recognize, weighing the answer against the internal metric he had built from decades of operating in a world where trust was a resource you audited carefully rather than extended freely. She did not look away. She had nothing to hide, and she knew how to hold a person's gaze without making it into a contest. Then he said with the same evenness he brought to everything I know. She waited. "On the third day here," he said, "I gave a member of my staff incorrect information about my schedule for this week. A specific detail that would only be useful to someone attempting to track movement in and out of this building." He picked up his phone. That detail appeared in a message Brett Holloway sent to a mutual contact this morning. He set it down again. "It was not you." Sloane absorbed this. "You were testing me," she said. He did not look apologetic. He did not look anything in particular. "Everyone who enters this space gets tested," he said. "Without exception, it is not personal." She felt the anger arrive clean and cool, different from the hot, helpless anger of the last 2 years. This was the anger of a person who has been conducting themselves carefully under observation they did not consent to, and it had edges rather than weight, something you could hold and examine rather than something that simply happened to you. "And if I had failed," she said, "you would have been removed from the building safely, and the problem of Brett Holloway would have remained your own." He picked up his espresso. "But you did not fail." There it was. Not a compliment. A result. A variable assigned its confirmed value. She looked at him across the marble island and thought about being watched for 3 days without knowing it, and following 3 rules she had not known were tests, and being found apparently to be exactly what she had said she was. She was not sure whether to be irritated or satisfied. She settled on both. "So now," she said, "what changes?" "Now," he said, "I work with more information than I had before." He looked at his phone. "And you stopped being an unresolved question." She looked at him steadily. There was something different in the space between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the slight easing of a structural tension, the kind that holds things in position, while an assessment runs and relaxes incrementally once the assessment is complete. The test was done. Something else was beginning, though she could not yet name what it was or what it required. That afternoon, Egan came to find her in the East Room and told her there had been an incident at Vero's. She was standing before he finished the sentence. Brett had gone to the restaurant. He had waited at the bar until the shift changed until Petra was finishing her close and moving through the parking structure to her car, and he had approached her there in the concrete dark of sub-level 2. He had told her that Sloan owed him something and that Petra was going to help him collect it and that if she needed a reason to cooperate, he was happy to provide one. Petra had not been hurt. She had been frightened enough to file a police report which would produce a case number and the same result Sloan's own report had produced 11 months ago. Paperwork, a pamphlet, the information that nothing could be done proactively. Egan reported this the way he reported everything factually without texture or editorial and waited. Sloan stood in the east room with her hands at her sides and felt the anger settle down to the bottom of things and go cold and very still. Petra had covered her shifts when she was sick. Petra had never once asked why she sometimes came to work with foundation applied more carefully on one side. Petra had been standing in a parking structure at shift change, being leaned on by a man who had no right to use her as anything at all. Egan, she said. He looked at her. I need to speak with Cassian. She found him in the inner room, seated at a desk she had not seen before working through something on a second laptop. He looked up when she came in, and she understood from the particular quality of his expression that he had already been briefed. He had been briefed and was waiting to see what she would do with the information. She sat down across the desk from him without being invited. She said, I need you to leave Petra alone. He waited. She is not involved in this, Sloan said. She does not know where I am. She cannot tell Brett anything useful. What he did to her tonight was not strategy. It was intimidation for its own sake because he could not reach me and she was available. She held his gaze. I know you want to handle this through your own channels in your own way. I am asking you to let me handle Petra. He held her gaze. And how do you intend to handle her? I will call her. I will tell her I am safe and that she should not answer any further contact from Brett, and that if he approaches her again, she should call me first, not the non-emergency line. Sloan leaned forward slightly. Petra will listen to me. She trusts me. What she does not need is two men deciding how to manage her fear on her behalf. Something shifted in Cassian's expression. Fractional. The adjustment of a calculation when a new piece of information is entered correctly and the result improves. He opened a drawer and placed a phone on the desk between them. Unregistered, he said. Do not call from the East Room. Use the secondary kitchen. Make it brief. She picked up the phone and started to rise. He said you did not have to come and ask. You could have simply done it. She stopped. She looked at him. I am in your house, she said. I follow the rules. A pause. Very brief. The kind you only register if you are paying close attention. Then he turned back to the laptop. She called Petra from the secondary kitchen, with the window cracked against the cold air coming off the lake, because the confined air of an interior room during a difficult conversation had always made her feel trapped. Petra answered on the second ring, talking fast, moving through the incident in the parking structure, with the particular velocity of someone still deciding how frightened they were permitted to be about it. Sloan listened. She let Petra move through the whole of it before she said anything. She did not interrupt to reassure or redirect. She simply listened the way she had always listened to Petra during the hard nights at the restaurant when something had gone wrong and Petra needed to say it before she could set it down. When Petra stopped, Sloan said, I am safe. I am somewhere Brett cannot reach. He is not going to be a problem for much longer. A silence. Then Petra said, how much longer? Sloan looked out the kitchen window at the gray winter sky above the city's roofline, the low, thick clouds that had been sitting over Chicago for 4 days holding all the cold in. I am working on it, she said. When she was done, she closed the phone and set it on the windowsill and stood for a moment with the cold air moving around her. She thought about Petra's voice, the relief in it once the fear had moved through enough to leave room for relief. She thought about the parking structure, the fluorescent concrete dark, the shift in Petra's face when Brett appeared. She thought about all the women she had known over the years, who had learned at various ages and in various ways the specific education of realizing that the world could not always be trusted to protect them and that they would need to build their own systems of protection, however improvised, however imperfect. She went back to the East Room and sat at the desk and opened the laptop and stared at the screen for a long time without doing anything useful. Then Cassian appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with his jacket off his shirt collar, open, his forearms visible. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. She looked back at him. The silence between them had developed a particular character over 4 days, losing the provisional quality of early silence and gaining something more settled. It had stopped being the silence of two people deciding what to say and become the silence of two people who had established that they did not need to fill space with words to occupy it together. "You handled that well," he said. She tilted her head. "Is that another test?" "No." He pushed off the door frame and came into the room and pulled the desk chair from the corner and sat in it, angled toward the window rather than toward her. It was the positioning of a man who thinks better without performing the act of thinking for an audience. He looked at the east-facing sky, which had gone the dark, saturated blue of late afternoon in winter, the last light gone from the clouds and only the city's ambient glow pushing back against the dark. He said, "I had a brother." She went completely still. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the window. 12 years ago, he said. He was inside the organization. Had been for 15 years, since before our father died. I trusted him because he had been present for every significant thing I had done in my adult life. He paused. The history was genuine. What I failed to account for was that genuine history can coexist with a decision made in a back room that the history had nothing to do with. Sloane sat very still and did not move or speak or reach for any of the reflexive sounds of sympathy that would have been easier than real listening. "He was not told to move against me," Cashin said. "He was told to pass information about a single shipment to a competing operation. He believed it was small enough that the consequences would be proportional. He was wrong about the scale." He looked at the whiskey glass in his hand, which she had not seen him bring in. 3 men died. He was not one of them. The room held this for a moment. The sounds of the building continued beneath the silence. The ventilation, the distant mechanical hum of the elevator cables, the building breathing. She looked at his profile, the sharp jaw, the unrevealing line of his mouth, the ink on his forearm where the sleeve had fallen back. "He must have been the loud kind," she said. He turned his head. He looked at her directly for the first time since he sat down. She did not look away. "He was not loud," Cashin said. His voice had shifted down slightly, losing a fraction of its usual controlled register, just enough for someone paying close attention to catch. "That was the part I did not understand for a long time. I had trained myself to watch for loud. Loud men telegraph. They leave evidence before the fact. My brother was quiet. He said the right things. He held the right positions. He had 12 years of consistent behavior behind him." He paused. I should have looked harder at what he was not saying. Sloane thought about 2 years of learning to read a person through what they withheld. The particular vocabulary of absence. The silences that meant something was building the stillness that was not peace but its precise counterfeit. She had become fluent in it without wanting to be, had developed the skill the way you develop any skill acquired under duress through repetition and consequence. "That is why you test everyone," she said. He looked back at the window. "Everyone who enters this space," he said, "without exception, it is not distrust. Distrust is a conclusion you have already reached. This is a process of gathering enough information to reach the right one." She looked at him, sitting in the corner chair with the glass loose in his hand and his face turned toward the darkening sky. She thought about the first night she had found him at the window and the quality of his presence then, that particular solitude of someone who has arranged their life very precisely around the absence of certain things and has made their peace with it, or something that passes for peace from a sufficient distance. She said, "Did you ever tell him what it cost?" A long pause. "No," he said. "He was removed from the organization. He is alive somewhere, living a smaller life than the one he was born to. I have not spoken to him since." He finished what was in the glass and set it on the floor beside the chair. "The cost is not a conversation I intend to have." She said nothing. She turned toward the window and looked at the east sky gone fully dark. Now the lights of the city doing what they always did at this hour, building their grid from the ground up, block by block, bridge by bridge, until the whole of Chicago was outlined in its own light against a sky it had long since outshone. He stayed in the corner chair for a while longer, not speaking, not explaining his continued presence, simply occupying the same room. When he finally stood and moved toward the door, he stopped in the frame for a moment the way he had stopped at the suite entrance on the first night when he had told her to try to sleep. He said, "Egan will have a report on Holloway's current location by tomorrow morning." She nodded. He said, "You should know that the testing period is over." She looked at him. "You are not a variable I am still assigning," he said. He held her gaze for one moment longer, the first time he had held her gaze for anything other than assessment purposes, and then he was gone, the corridor receiving him silently. Sloane sat at the desk after he left and did not immediately move. She thought about what he had said about his brother. She thought about the 12 years of trust that had preceded the betrayal and the 12 years of absence that had followed it. She thought about how a person builds their systems of protection after a wound like that. The particular architecture required the specific materials, and she thought about a man who had responded to the deepest betrayal of his adult life, not by closing himself entirely, but by building a process, a method, a way of letting people in that generated enough information to justify the risk. It was, she thought, not so different from what she had been doing, moving through the world carefully, paying close attention, not trusting what had not yet proven itself. She understood him better in the dark of the East Room with the city burning outside the window than she had understood him at any point in the preceding 4 days. And she thought she understood something else too, something she was not ready to examine directly yet, something she would leave where it was until she had more information. She closed the laptop and went to the window. The city was fully into its evening, committed and continuous and indifferent. She stood there for a while, long enough for the cold coming through the glass to register through the cashmere. Then she stepped back from the window and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She was not peaceful exactly. She was not resolved. She was in the middle of something unfinished, with a man who had just handed her a piece of himself. He did not hand to anyone, and with an ex-boyfriend who was still out there somewhere running out of moves and about to simplify his approach in the way that men with no vocabulary except force always eventually did. But she was not running, and she was not afraid. And there was a real and meaningful distance between those two things in the state she had been living in for 2 years, and that distance was enough. She lay back on the bed. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Brett somewhere in the north side of the city in a mid-range hotel room, pacing probably, or not pacing, sitting very still, the way he sat when he was planning rather than reacting, which was when he was actually dangerous. She thought about him trying to figure out his next move on a board he did not understand, and arriving as men like him always arrived at the only move he knew how to make. He was going to come back to this building. She was going to be ready when he did. She closed her eyes. She slept. The 5th day brought a different kind of tension. She had been in the gym on 14 when her phone, the unregistered one Egan had given her for Petra, showed a message from a number she did not recognize. 4 words, "I know you are there." She stood on the treadmill and read the message 3 times. Then she got off the treadmill and went upstairs. Cashin was in the inner room. Egan was already there. When she came in, Cashin looked at her and then at the phone in her hand and held out his hand for it. She gave it to him. He read the message and turned it to show Egan without a word. Then he set it on the desk. She said, "How did he get this number? This phone is unregistered." "Petra does not have this number." He said he did not get it from Petra. She waited. He said the number was generated from within this building. "Someone on my staff gave him an unregistered number that I assigned to you." He paused. "This is separate from the first incident." She understood what he was not saying. The first test had told him someone on his staff had given Brett information about the building. This told him it was an ongoing problem rather than a single lapse. There was more than one person, or one person more committed than he had initially assessed. He said, "I need you to understand that this does not change your safety here. The measures around your room and your movements are unaffected." She said, "I understand. What does it change?" He said, "My timetable." He picked up his own phone. "I was going to wait for Holloway to make his next move. I am no longer going to wait." She nodded. She started to leave. He said, "Sloane." She stopped. He said, "You were right to bring that to me immediately." He said it without looking up from his phone in the same even register he used for everything. And she understood it for what it was, which was not a compliment, but a statement of fact from a man who stated facts and left the rest to the listener. She went back to the East Room and sat at the desk and looked out the window at the city and felt with a clarity that was new and somewhat startling that she was not afraid. Not of Brett, not of the informant in the building, not of what came next. She was alert and she was watchful, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be. And there was something in that combination, alertness without fear, that felt like a thing she had not felt in a very long time. It felt like herself. On the 6th morning, Sloane woke before her alarm. She lay in the dark of the East Room and looked at the ceiling and listened to the building. She had learned its sounds over the past several days, the way she had learned the sounds of every space she had occupied long enough to stop being a guest in. The hum of the ventilation cycling through its overnight rhythm, the distant muffled sound of elevator cables moving in the building's core, the occasional low tone of a door closing several floors below. The building was never fully silent. It breathed in its own steady register, and she had found without deciding to find it, that sleeping inside that breath was easier than sleeping inside the silence of her own apartment, which had been the silence of a space perpetually braced for interruption. She got up at 6:15 and went to the secondary kitchen and made coffee and stood at the east window with the mug in both hands and watched Chicago find its morning. The city was doing what Chicago does in late autumn, committing fully to its own gray, the sky and the lake, and the upper atmosphere arriving at the same shade of pewter without negotiation. A monochrome that had its own beauty if you stopped expecting color from it. The streets below were beginning their morning inventory. The first delivery trucks, the early cabs, the small figures of people on foot moving with the particular forward lean of people who have made their peace with cold weather and simply moved through it. She thought about Brett. She had been thinking about Brett the way you think about weather, when the forecast is already issued and you cannot change it. Not obsessively, but as a background condition, something to factor into what you were going to do with the day. Egan had delivered a report 3 mornings ago, a single printed page placed on her desk, without comment, and she had read it and folded it and thought about what it meant. Brett Holloway was staying at a mid-range hotel on the north side 11 blocks from her apartment building. He had not returned to his own place in Wicker Park. He had retained a civil attorney, not a criminal one, which told her the shape of what he was planning in that register. He had contacted the management of Veros, twice presenting himself as a concerned former associate, checking on her own welfare, which was the particular kind of move that looked like care to people who did not know him and looked like what it was to people who did. He was not going away. But he was also, she understood now, not simply a man with a temper and an inability to accept an ending. He was a man running out of moves in a game he did not fully understand the board of, and men in that position made mistakes. They simplified. They went back to what had worked before: the direct approach, the physical presence, the application of personal force, because they had no other vocabulary for the problem. She finished her coffee and rinsed the mug and went to find Egan. He was in his usual position, near the elevator, the hallway chair outside the main suite door, sitting with the particular contained readiness of a man who had been doing this for long enough that the preparedness and the rest had become indistinguishable. She said, "Has Cassian seen the full report on Holloway?" Egan said yes. She said, "Is there a plan?" Egan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You should ask him directly." She nodded and went back inside. Cassian was at the island with the laptop, both espressos already done. He was working through something on the screen with the focused downward posture of a man inside a difficult problem. He did not look up immediately when she came in, and she had stopped reading this as indifference. She understood by now that when he finished the thought he was in the middle of, he would surface. He did not like leaving things incomplete. He closed the laptop and looked at her. She said, "What are you planning to do about Brett?" He said, "What would you like me to do about him?" She looked at him steadily. She understood this was not a deflection. It was a genuine question from a man for whom her answer was a real variable in the calculation. She said, "I want him gone from my life. Not frightened off, not relocated, not given a reason to feel he was forced out and therefore justified in coming back eventually. I want what he has been doing to have a consequence that is public enough that he cannot rewrite it afterward into something that makes him the injured party." Cassian looked at her. She said, "I know what you are capable of. I am not asking for that. I am asking for something that closes this in a way that stays closed." He said, "I know what you are asking for. I have been building it for 3 days. He stood and moved around the island and picked up his jacket from the bar stool. "The question I needed to answer before I could move forward was whether you wanted to be present when it happened or not." She said, "I want to be present." He looked at her, then he said, "Stay close to Egan today. It will most likely be this evening." He put on his jacket. He moved toward the corridor. She said, "Cassian." He stopped. He turned. She said, "Thank you. For 3 days ago. The corner chair. You did not have to." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved briefly in his expression, too quick and too quiet to name. Then he said, "Neither did you." And he was gone. She spent the day doing the things that had become her structure. The gym in the morning, the ankle fully operational, now the bruise reduced to a faint shadow. Lunch at the desk, the laptop in the afternoon, completing the last of the professional correspondence, from Varro's composing it in the careful neutral language of someone closing a chapter without burning the bridge entirely. She was not anxious. She noticed this with the mild interest you bring to a surprising piece of information. The low-frequency hum that had been her background radiation for 6 months, the constant alert state of a body waiting for the next impact, had shifted into something with a direction. Not peace exactly, intention. At 4 in the afternoon, Egan appeared in the doorway of the East Room and said, "You should come." She followed him to the main suite. Two additional men she had not seen before were standing near the far wall, positioned with the professional stillness she had learned to recognize as a baseline rather than a warning. They looked at her briefly when she entered and redirected their attention to Cassian, who was standing at the windows with his phone in his hand and his jacket still on. He turned when she came in. He said Holloway arrived at the hotel entrance 14 minutes ago. He is at the front desk now. She absorbed this without visible reaction. He said he has your address of record from a contact at your former building management. He believes you are staying here as a registered guest under a secondary name. He has a story prepared about being your emergency contact. He set the phone down. He has used my name twice at the front desk. At full speaking volume, Sloan looked at him. She understood the significance of this immediately. Not because she had ever operated in his world, but because she had spent 3 years managing a dining room, and she knew what it meant when someone said a name like a weapon they expected to detonate on contact. Brett had walked into the lobby of the Aldrich Grand and said Cassian Drave's name out loud at a hotel desk in a building that the Drave family owned as leverage, as though the name would open a door for him rather than seal every door in the building against him permanently. He does not understand what he has done, she said. Cassian held her gaze. No, he said. He does not. She said, what happens now? He said, I am going downstairs. She said, I am coming with you. He looked at her. This was the moment she had learned to recognize over 6 days, the moment when his calculation ran, when variables were weighted and outcome assessed. She held his gaze and did not fill the silence. He said, stay behind Egan. Do not speak unless I ask you directly. She nodded. They took the private elevator down. The descent was quiet. Cassian stood with his hands in his jacket pockets looking at the steel doors. The 2 additional men flanked the back of the car. Egan was at Sloane's shoulder. She looked at the floor numbers descending and breathed steadily and thought about nothing except the next 60 seconds. The doors opened onto the lobby level. The Aldrich Grand in the late afternoon carried a different quality of light than it did at night. The winter sun came low through the tall front windows and laid long, flat rectangles of cold gold across the marble floor. The lobby held a moderate spread of guests, a couple with luggage near the bell stand, a businessman reading near the window, a group of conference attendees moving toward the far corridor. And at the concierge desk, his back to the elevator bank, was Brett Holloway. She knew his back. She knew the set of his shoulders when he had reached the limit of patience and made the decision to stop being managed. She knew the angle of his head when he was looking down at someone from a height advantage he was consciously using. She knew all of this with the bone-deep specificity of someone who had spent 2 years inside the orbit of a person and had paid very close attention as a matter of survival. She stayed behind Egan and watched. Cassian crossed the lobby. He did not move quickly. He moved the way he moved through every space with the unhurried, absolute ease of a man for whom this particular floor was an extension of his own operating environment, because the marble under his shoes and the brass fittings and the orchid arrangements and the very air conditioning running overhead existed because of decisions he had made and continued to make. Everyone in the room understood this on some level before they consciously registered his presence. The lobby changed when he entered it, not dramatically, not loudly. The businessman by the window closed his book without realizing he had done it. The couple near the bell stand shifted their trajectory by 6 inches for no articulable reason. The 2 conference attendees who had been mid-sentence paused and found their sentences again a beat late. It was the oldest human signal, the recognition of something at the apex of a hierarchy, moving through a space delivered and received entirely below the threshold of conscious thought. Brett did not notice. Brett was leaning his forearms on the desk. His voice at the low controlled volume she recognized as his second-to-last register before it went somewhere worse. He was explaining something. He was explaining it in the patient, faintly contemptuous tone of a man who believes the person he is addressing is being deliberately obstructive rather than genuinely unable to help him. He did not notice the lobby shift around him. He did not notice the bell staff member take 2 involuntary steps back from the luggage cart. He did not notice the concierge's hands go still on the keyboard. He did not notice any of it. He did not notice until Cassian stopped 4 feet behind him. The concierge noticed. His eyes went to Cassian and then immediately, with tremendous discipline, back to a point on the desk's surface, and the change in his expression, the shift from strained professional patience to the stillness of a person who is no longer the most important presence in a situation, was visible from where Sloane stood across the lobby. Brett felt the change move through the room. She watched it register in his shoulders before he understood it. A fractional tightening, the physical equivalent of a system receiving input it has not yet identified. He turned his head. He saw Cassian. She watched Brett Holloway understand where he was. Not all at once. It moved through him in stages, each one visible from 20 feet away, each one confirming something she had known for a long time about men like him. The initial confidence, the assumption that whatever he was turning toward could be managed with size and certainty, the social gravity of a man who had never been seriously challenged. Then the recognition, the name arriving in his memory from the place where he had been storing it as a weapon and landing instead as its exact opposite. Then the recalibration, fast but not fast enough, the attempt to reconstruct a posture appropriate to the situation he was now understanding he was actually in. Then the stillness, the kind that arrives when a body decides the safest immediate option is to stop moving entirely. Cassian did not speak to Brett. He turned to the concierge. He said, in the same even register he used for everything at the same volume, call the non-emergency line. This man has been making criminal threats against a hotel guest and using my name without authorization at this desk. I have recordings from the lobby system, time-stamped, covering the last 7 days. He looked at the concierge without any particular expression. Please make the call now. The concierge reached for the phone. Brett said, I was not threatening anyone. I am looking for someone. I have every right to. Cassian turned and looked at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply turned and brought the full weight of his attention to bear on Brett Holloway, and Brett stopped talking in the middle of his own sentence. Not because of a threat, not because of a gesture, because of the specific quality of being looked at by someone who has made a very large number of decisions about a very large number of people and has no remaining uncertainty about the category you belong to. The lobby was completely quiet. Sloane stood behind Egan and watched Brett Holloway, who had spent 2 years being the largest presence in any room he entered, stand completely still in the lobby of a hotel he had walked into as though it belonged to him, and understand that it did not, that nothing in it belonged to him, that he was standing inside someone else's house, having said someone else's name as a key, and found that it opened nothing at all. He looked around the lobby. He was looking, she understood, for the audience he always required, the witness to his authority, the room that would confirm by its response that he was what he believed himself to be. He found the businessman who had closed his book and was standing near the far wall watching. He found the conference attendees who had stopped at the corridor entrance. He found the bell staff, the concierge, every face in the lobby oriented toward the same point. And then he found Sloane. She was standing at the elevator bank with Egan at her shoulder, and she was not hidden, and she was not flinching, and she was not the version of herself he had spent 2 years calibrating, the version that braced and absorbed and diminished to accommodate the weather of his moods. She was standing in the flat gold afternoon light of the lobby with her weight evenly on both feet and her hands at her sides, and she was looking at him with the particular quality of attention of a person who has paid very close attention to a thing for a very long time and has finally, from a sufficient distance, simply seen it clearly. Something went out of Brett's face. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was quiet the way the end of things is often quiet rather than loud. A simple evacuation of the energy that had been sustaining a position that was no longer sustainable. 2 years of certainty. 2 years of her making herself smaller so his world could stay the size he required it to be. All of it draining out of his face in the lobby of a hotel he had walked into, believing he still had the right to walk into. The police arrived 11 minutes later, 2 officers responsive and professional who spoke with the concierge and reviewed the material that Cassian's building manager had prepared. The log of incidents, the time-stamped security footage, the record of threats made against a named hotel guest across 7 days. Brett had a civil attorney. What he did not have was a criminal one, And the distinction mattered now in a way it had not mattered to him when he retained the first one, because the charges being filed were not civil. She watched him walk out of the Aldrich Grand between two uniformed officers through the tall front doors and into the flat gray late afternoon of a Chicago winter. Past the idling cabs and the doorman and the ordinary ongoing traffic of a city going about its evening entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what was resolving itself on its sidewalk. He did not look back. She had half expected him to look back. He did not. There was a particular kind of ending she had come to understand that arrived not with a bang or a confrontation or a speech, but with the simple, unremarkable sound of a door closing on a person who was no longer a force in your life. 2 years. 700 and some odd days of learning the specific topography of another person's anger, of mapping the landscape of their moods. The way you map a terrain you have to cross daily, of learning which routes were safe and which were not. All of that, and the end of it was a man in a coat being walked through a set of glass doors by two officers who would process the paperwork and move on with their evening, and a lobby that redistributed itself in his wake as though he had been no more significant than any other disturbance that had passed through its marble floor. She found she was not angry. She was not relieved in the way she had expected to be relieved. She was simply present, standing on the marble with the flat afternoon light coming through the tall windows and the city going about its business beyond the glass, and she was aware of herself standing there in a way she had not been aware of herself standing anywhere in a very long time, aware of her own weight and the ground beneath it and the steadiness of both. She stood at the elevator bank after the lobby doors had closed behind him and the room had redistributed itself back into its ordinary rhythms. The couple resuming their trajectory to the bell stand, the businessman sitting back down, the concierge straightening the items on his desk with the precise, deliberate movements of a person restoring order. Egan stood beside her and said nothing. She waited for the relief. She had been anticipating relief the way you anticipate a weather system that has been forecast for days, with the weary patience of someone who has been carrying an umbrella for a long time and is finally standing in the rain. What arrived was different. It was a stillness, not the braced stillness of waiting for something to happen, not the controlled stillness of managing a room, the stillness of a space that has been under sustained pressure for a long time and has finally been allowed to simply be its own shape. She stood in the lobby of the Aldrich Grand and breathed and felt for the first time in 2 years the particular quality of air that exists in a room where no one is about to hurt her. She looked up. Cashin was standing at the far edge of the lobby near the corridor that led to the private elevators. He was looking at her, not with the measuring, categorizing attention of the elevator on the first night or the calculated assessment of the island on the first morning, with something quieter than that, something that had no operational function, no data collection, purpose, no assessment running underneath it. She crossed the lobby toward him. They rode the elevator up in silence, Egan behind them, the numbers climbing past the residential floors. She looked at the doors and thought about the first time she had ridden this elevator, throwing herself through the gap, hitting the control panel, not looking at what was already inside. She thought about all the things she had not looked at clearly enough for long enough, and about what that kind of not looking costs, and about the slow incremental process of learning to look again. The suite was quiet when they entered. The additional men were gone. The space had returned to its spare geometry, the charcoal sofa, and the dark leather chair, and the 40 feet of Chicago framed in glass. Sloane stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she went to the East Hall. She went to her room. She stood at the desk, and she looked at the canvas bag on the floor beside it. She picked it up. She set it on the bed and unzipped it and looked at its contents. The socks and the underwear, and the 2 worn shirts and the toothbrush and the running shoes she had packed in the last seconds before leaving her apartment a week ago. The entire portable inventory of a life assembled in a hurry. She had carried this bag into this building 7 days ago with nothing left to protect, and had found in the process of protecting herself something she had not been looking for and could not yet fully name. She zipped the bag closed. She carried it out of the east room and down the corridor and into the main suite, and she set it down on the hardwood floor beside the glass coffee table. The sound it made was the same sound it had made when she dropped it in her own kitchen a week ago. The same quiet, soft thud, the sound of a life that fits in a bag you can carry while running. She placed the white envelope on the glass table beside the bag. The same envelope that had traveled with her from the Aldrich Grand to her apartment to this building a week ago. She had kept it in the desk drawer in the East Room. She put it on the table now and straightened and looked at the windows. Cassian was standing there, his back to the room, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at Chicago the way he always looked at it from this height, with the long, patient attention of a man who had spent years using the city as a surface to think against. "The door stays closed now," she said, "which means I do not need it anymore." He did not turn immediately. She stood and let the silence have its time. She had learned over 7 days that he processed things at his own rate, and that rushing the process produced nothing worth having. He turned. He looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at the canvas bag. He looked at her face in the evening light coming through the windows, the long horizontal light of a winter sunset that had no warmth left in it, but had a certain honesty, the light that shows things as they are, rather than as they might be imagined. And she asked him the question she had been carrying for 2 days without knowing she was carrying it. She said, "Do you ever get tired of owning the whole city and living in it alone?" The question landed in the room and stayed there, not as sentiment, not as an opening move in something she had scripted, as a genuine question from a person who had watched a man move through an enormous amount of space for 7 days and had noticed underneath all of it the particular quality of someone who has arranged their life very carefully around the absence of certain things. He was very still. Then he crossed the room. He moved toward her with the same contained ease he brought to everything, closing the distance without hurry, without announcement. He stopped at the other side of the coffee table, close enough that she could see the faint silver lines of old scars across his knuckles, and the precise dark geometry of the ink on his forearms, and she could smell faintly the cedar and cold smoke of him, the scent she had scrubbed at in the shower on the first morning, and had simply stopped fighting at some point because it had become part of the air she breathed in this building. He said, "Stay." She looked at him. He said, "Not because the door needs guarding, not because you are a variable that requires management." He looked down at the canvas bag on the floor between them and then back up at her. "Because I would like to find out what you do when there is nothing left to run from." The room held this. She thought about the first night in the elevator, the rapid arithmetic of threat and escape and narrowing options, and the cold clarifying moment when she recognized who she was looking at and understood that she had traded one kind of danger for another. She thought about walking back into this building with a canvas bag and an envelope, and the particular species of desperation that has burned through its own performance and becomes simply the bare fact of itself. She thought about 7 days of rules and tests and corner chairs in the secondary kitchen, and Petra's voice and what he had said about his brother in the growing dark of a winter afternoon. She thought about standing in the lobby 30 minutes ago and watching Brett's face empty of the thing that had been sustaining it, and feeling instead of triumph that profound spreading stillness, that clean, simple absence of bracing. She looked at Cassian Drave, who had asked her in an elevator with a voice completely free of inflection, whether tonight was the first time or whether it had happened before, and who had not been asking because he intended to rescue her from the answer, but because it was a real question and he was a person who asked real questions and waited for the real answers. She looked at him, standing at the other side of a glass table in the high, clean vault of his penthouse with the lights of Chicago coming on below them, and the lake invisible in the dark to the east, and the whole city running on its systems 40 floors down. And she thought about what it meant that this man who had spent a decade assembling walls with the precision of an architect had sat in a corner chair in her room and told her about his brother. She bent down and picked up the canvas bag. She held it in both hands for a moment. She felt the weight of it, which was not much, which had never been much, a week's worth of the bare necessities and nothing else. She thought about all the things she had not packed when she left her apartment. The photographs, the throw blanket from her sister, the 7 years of small accumulated evidence that a person had lived in a particular set of rooms and meant to go on living there. She set the bag back down on the floor, not near the door, not on the table, back on the hardwood in the same spot, in the same position, making the same small certain sound of something finding its place. She straightened. She walked to the long charcoal sofa that faced the windows. The sofa she had sat on the first night, curled into the corner with her knees to her chest and her arms around her shins and the cold leather against the backs of her legs and the city burning in the glass in front of her, and no idea whatsoever what came next. She sat down, not in the corner, in the center. Both feet on the floor, weight settled spine easy against the back cushion, hands resting open on her thighs. She looked at the windows and the city beyond them. The grid of light that spread from this height to every horizon, the lake a dark edge to the east, the long lit parallels of the avenues going out toward the limits of what she could see. She heard him move behind her, the quiet sound of the leather chair pulled slightly on the hardwood, the soft impact of him settling into it. The chair where he had sat the evening he told her about his brother, where he had sat and looked at the darkening sky and used her presence as permission to be for 45 minutes simply himself. Neither of them spoke. The city burned in the windows. Below them, 40 floors down, Chicago was doing what it always did at this hour, moving and making noise and conducting its business with the relentless, indifferent energy of a thing that does not require permission from anyone to continue. The lake absorbed the eastern sky and gave nothing back. The grid of lights spread in every direction, orderly and vast, each one representing a life being lived in a room that had nothing to do with this room and no idea this room existed. Up here in the high still vault of the Aldrich Grand Penthouse with the canvas bag on the floor and the envelope on the table, in the evening light fading to darken the glass, everything was quiet. Not the braced quiet of waiting. Not the hollow quiet of a space that has been emptied of something it needed. The quiet of two people who had arrived at the same place from very different directions across a week of careful and honest exchanges, and had found that the place itself was larger than either of them had originally allowed for, and that they were both, for perhaps the first time in a long time, simply in it. Sloane breathed, in and out, steady and slow. The ventilation system moved its quiet rhythm through the building. The city went on going. The dark settled fully over Chicago, and the lights took over from the sky, and the room held what it held. She was not running. For the first time in 2 years, she was not running and had no intention of running, and the ground beneath her felt solid in a way she had spent a long time not believing ground could be. She let it be exactly that. She did not try to name it or frame it or assess what it was going to require of her. She simply let it be what it was right now in this room with this man sitting behind her in the chair, and the city burning in the glass, and the canvas bag settled on the hardwood floor, with a certain quietness of something that has finally stopped moving. Some doors, she had learned, do not close because you are pushed through them. They close because you finally stop running long enough to choose to walk through them. She had spent 2 years learning that lesson the hard way. One bruise at a time, one locked door at a time, one night of listening for footsteps that never quite went away. She was done with that kind of learning. Whatever came next, she was going to walk into it with her eyes open and her weight on both feet and her hands at her sides the way she had stood in the lobby 40 minutes ago, watching the end of something that had taken too long to end. The city burned. Cassian did not speak. Sloane did not move. And the room held both of them in its high quiet vault above Chicago, and the night came on, and neither of them had anywhere else to be. If you have been sitting with this story, if Sloane's courage to stop running and choose her own door moves something in you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the best stories are not about the people who never get knocked down. They are about the ones who get back up and walk through the right door. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I love seeing our community from all across this country and around the world. I have another story coming tomorrow that you are not going to want to miss. All right, until next time.